At 2:47 in the morning on March 15th, 1943, Lieutenant Commander Harold Bentley stood on the bridge of HMS Starling, watching something that shouldn't exist floating 200 yards off his starboard bow. A massive steel net, 400 feet long and 60 feet deep, stretched between two modified fishing trawlers like a spiderweb designed by a madman. The Royal Navy had laughed at this contraption for 8 months, called it Bentley's folly, a waste of resources during Britain's darkest hour. But in the next 20 minutes, that ridiculous net would do something no one thought possible. It would capture a German U-boat alive. If you want to see how a fishing net became Britain's most effective anti-submarine weapon, please hit that like button right now. Every like helps us share these forgotten innovations from World War II. And subscribe because we're about to reveal how one man's crazy idea saved thousands of Allied lives. Back to Bentley. He'd been obsessing over submarine warfare for 2 years. March 1941. The Battle of the Atlantic was killing Britain slowly. German U-boats were sinking Allied merchant ships faster than shipyards could replace them. 300 ships lost in March alone. 500 in April. Britain was starving. Literally starving. Food rationing had reduced the average meal to bread and potatoes. Children in Liverpool hadn't seen an orange in 6 months. The Royal Navy was losing the war beneath the waves. Depth charges worked if you could find the submarine. Sonar worked if the U-boat captain was stupid enough to stay in one place. But German submarine commanders weren't stupid. They were professionals, veterans. They'd perfected wolfpack tactics that turned convoys into floating graveyards. Bentley commanded anti-submarine patrols out of Portsmouth. He'd watched 23 merchant ships die in his sector, watched good men drown in oil-slicked water while U-boats escaped into the darkness. Standard Royal Navy doctrine said chase the submarines, drop depth charges, hope for the best. Bentley thought that doctrine was killing British sailors. The problem wasn't finding U-boats. Royal Navy sonar could track them for miles. The problem was catching them. German submarines could dive to 600 feet. They could run silent for hours. They could hide behind thermal layers that scattered sonar signals like light through a prism. Once a U-boat went deep and quiet, it became invisible. Bentley had a different idea. What if you didn't chase submarines? What if you trapped them instead? He'd grown up in Cornwall watching fishing boats work the channel. Trawlers used massive nets to capture entire schools of fish. The fish swam into the net thinking they were safe. By the time they realized their mistake, escape was impossible. What worked for fish might work for submarines. The concept was simple. Deploy a steel net across a U-boat's escape route. When the submarine tried to surface or change course, it would tangle in the mesh. The more it struggled, the more entangled it became. Like a spider's web, but for steel sharks weighing 700 tons. Bentley presented his idea to Admiral Sir Percy Noble in April 1941. The meeting lasted 12 minutes. Noble listened politely, asked 3 questions, then rejected the proposal completely. His exact words, according to Bentley's diary, were, "Commander, we are fighting a modern war with modern weapons against a modern enemy. We are not Viking fishermen casting nets for herring." But Bentley couldn't let go of the idea. He spent his off-duty hours sketching net designs. He calculated mesh sizes, steel specifications, deployment methods. He studied German submarine tactics, analysed attack patterns, mapped escape routes. The more he researched, the more convinced he became that nets could work. The steel had to be specific. Too light and U-boat propellers would shred it. Too heavy and trawlers couldn't deploy it. Bentley calculated that 1-inch steel cable woven in 8-foot squares would provide the perfect balance, strong enough to stop a submarine, light enough to handle quickly. Deployment was the real challenge. A 400-foot net weighed 12 tons. It required 2 vessels working in perfect coordination. 1 trawler would anchor at each end. Between them, the net would hang like a curtain 60 feet below the surface, invisible to periscope observation, undetectable to sonar. A steel trap waiting in empty ocean. Bentley refined his calculations through the summer of 1941. He studied U-boat attack reports, looking for patterns. German submarines preferred attacking at night from the surface. They used electric motors when submerged, diesel engines when surfaced. Most attacks came from periscope depth, 30 to 40 feet below the waves. That depth was perfect. Bentley's nets would hang at 20 to 80 feet deep. Any submarine trying to attack from periscope depth would swim directly into the mesh. The captain wouldn't see it coming. By the time the submarine's hull hit steel cable, escape would be impossible. In August 1941, Bentley submitted a second proposal. This time he included detailed engineering drawings, cost estimates, crew requirements. He calculated that one net deployment cost £47, one depth charge attack cost £180. The nets were 4 times more economical than conventional anti-submarine weapons. Admiral Noble rejected the second proposal after reading the cover page. He didn't look at the drawings, didn't review the calculations, just stamped denied across the front and returned it to Bentley the same day. Noble's staff officers were more direct in their criticism. They called Bentley's net idea primitive, outdated, embarrassing. One commander told him he should transfer to the fishing fleet if he wanted to play with nets. Another suggested he'd been reading too many stories about Viking longships. The Royal Navy in 1941 was an institution built on tradition and technology. Steel warships, radar systems, depth charges, sonar. These were modern weapons for modern warfare. Fishing nets belonged in the past, not in the Battle of the Atlantic. But Bentley had studied the numbers. German submarines were winning. U-boat production was increasing. Allied shipping losses were accelerating. Traditional anti-submarine tactics weren't working. Something had to change, or Britain would lose the war by starvation. Bentley decided to test his net theory privately. He used his personal connections to arrange meetings with fishing fleet captains. These men understood nets better than anyone in the Royal Navy. They understood currents, deployment techniques, maintenance procedures. Captain William Morrison commanded a trawler fleet out of Grimsby. He'd been fishing the North Sea for 30 years. Morrison examined Bentley's drawings and nodded slowly. The concept made sense to him. Fish were smart, but they still swam into nets. Submarines were just bigger fish. Morrison agreed to help with an unofficial test. He provided 2 trawlers and experienced crews. Bentley provided the steel cable and specifications. They would deploy the net in the North Sea during routine patrol operations. If it worked, Bentley would have proof for the Admiralty. If it failed, nobody would know they tried. The first test was scheduled for October 15th, 1941. Weather delayed it until October 22nd, then November 8th, then November 20th. Each delay gave Bentley more time to refine the design, but it also gave him more time to worry about whether the concept would actually work. Morrison's crews were skeptical. They understood fishing nets, but submarine nets were different. The scale was massive. The stakes were life and death. If the net failed during deployment, both trawlers could be damaged or sunk. If it worked too well, they might capture a U-boat they couldn't handle. November 20th finally arrived with perfect conditions. Calm seas, light wind, no German air activity reported. Morrison's 2 trawlers, HMS Grimsby and HMS Hull, took positions 400 yards apart. Between them, Bentley's steel net hung invisible beneath the surface. The test lasted 6 hours. No submarines appeared. The net deployed smoothly and recovered without problems. The steel cable showed no stress damage. The trawler crews worked efficiently. Everything functioned exactly as Bentley had calculated, but there was no proof. No captured submarine. No dramatic validation of the concept. Just a successful deployment of an untested weapon system that had never engaged an enemy target. Bentley wrote his third proposal in December 1941. This time he included photographs from the test deployment, crew testimonials, and a detailed operational plan. He requested authorization for expanded trials with dedicated naval vessels. Admiral Noble read this proposal more carefully. The photographs were impressive, the crew testimonials were positive, the operational plan was thorough, but the concept still seemed primitive to him. Fishing nets against modern submarines felt wrong, even if the engineering was sound. Noble's response came in January 1942. Not a complete rejection this time, but not approval either. He authorized limited trials using existing patrol vessels. If Bentley could demonstrate results against actual German submarines, the Royal Navy would consider broader implementation. Bentley had his chance, but he also had a problem. How do you test anti-submarine nets when submarines are actively trying to kill you? The solution came from an unexpected source. Royal Navy intelligence had been tracking U-boat patrol patterns for months. They knew which routes German submarines used to reach hunting grounds. They knew approximate timing for submarine movements. Most importantly, they knew where U-boats would be most vulnerable to capture. German submarines followed predictable patterns when returning to base. They surfaced at night to recharge batteries. They used the same navigation routes, month after month. They became careless when they thought they were safe in home waters. Intelligence identified a perfect location for net deployment: the Hebrides Gap, a narrow channel between Scotland and the Outer Hebrides. German submarines used this route regularly when transiting to and from Atlantic hunting grounds. The channel was deep enough for submerged transit, but narrow enough for effective net coverage. Bentley requested permission to deploy experimental nets in the Hebrides Gap during February 1942. This time, Admiral Noble approved the request immediately. Intelligence supported it. Operational commanders endorsed it. Everyone wanted to try something new against the U-boat menace. But approval came with conditions. Bentley would command the operation personally. He would use his own ship, HMS Starling, and volunteer crews only. If the nets failed, if ships were lost, if the operation became a disaster, Bentley would take full responsibility. He accepted those conditions without hesitation. This was his chance to prove that simple solutions could solve complex problems. That innovation mattered more than tradition, that sometimes the most ridiculous ideas worked better than conventional wisdom. HMS Starling sailed from Portsmouth on February 28, 1942. Destination: the Hebrides Gap. Mission: deploy experimental anti-submarine nets and wait for German submarines to find them. Or more precisely, wait for German submarines to swim into them. What happened next would prove that Harold Bentley wasn't crazy. He was just thinking differently about an old problem. The first deployment in the Hebrides Gap took place on March 3, 1942, at 0400 hours in complete darkness. Bentley positioned his two support vessels, converted fishing trawlers now designated HMS Otter and HMS Seal, exactly 400 yards apart in the narrowest section of the channel. Between them, his experimental steel net descended into black water like a massive invisible curtain. The crews worked in absolute silence. No radio chatter, no unnecessary engine noise, no lights except the dim red lamps used for essential navigation. German submarines relied on hydrophones to detect surface vessels. Any unusual sound could alert a U-boat captain that something was waiting for him. Bentley had calculated the optimal deployment depth based on intelligence reports about German submarine behaviour. Most U-boats transited this area at periscope depth, roughly 40 feet below the surface. His net hung from 20 feet to 80 feet deep, creating a steel trap that would catch any submarine trying to pass through at standard operating depth. The waiting began at 0430. Intelligence predicted that German submarines would use this route between 0600 and 0800 hours, taking advantage of pre-dawn darkness for surface transit. Bentley stationed himself on the bridge of HMS Starling, positioned 800 yards south of the net deployment, close enough to respond quickly, far enough away to avoid detection. At 0547, the sonar operator reported contact. Bearing 315 degrees, range 2,200 yards, speed 8 knots, depth 35 feet. The acoustic signature matched known German submarine profiles. A U-boat was approaching the trap, exactly as intelligence had predicted. Bentley felt his heart rate increase. 8 months of mockery and rejection had led to this moment. Either his fishing net concept would work, or he would watch another German submarine escape to kill Allied merchant ships. There was no middle ground. The submarine maintained course and speed. The captain was running submerged but not deep, probably using his periscope to navigate through the channel. Standard procedure for German submarines in these waters. The U-boat was following a route that thousands of Allied sailors had died to discover. At 0551, sonar reported the submarine at 1,400 yards range, still approaching. Bentley keyed his radio once, a pre-arranged signal to the trawler crews. Maintain positions. Keep the net steady. Let the trap work. The acoustic signature grew stronger. 1,200 yards. 1,000 yards. 800 yards. The German submarine was swimming directly toward the invisible steel mesh hanging in its path. The captain had no way to know what was waiting for him. No sonar system could detect individual cables suspended in water. At 0554, the sonar operator reported something strange. The submarine's acoustic signature had changed. Engine noise was increasing. Propeller cavitation was becoming erratic. The U-boat was struggling with something, but the sonar couldn't determine what. Bentley grabbed his binoculars and scanned the water between the two trawlers. The surface was dark, calm, empty, nothing visible from his position 800 yards away. But somewhere beneath those black waves, his steel net was doing exactly what he had designed it to do. The hydrophone operator on HMS Otter reported mechanical sounds from the trapped submarine. Metal grinding against metal, electric motors running at maximum power, compressed air being released from ballast tanks. The U-boat was trying everything to break free from the net. At 0557, bubbles began appearing on the surface between the trawlers. Not the normal bubble stream from a submarine's ballast tanks, but violent churning water that indicated something was thrashing beneath the waves. The net was holding. The submarine was caught. Bentley ordered HMS Starling to close distance. As his ship approached the deployment area, he could see the steel cables vibrating with tension. The net was stretched tight, strained by the weight and power of a trapped submarine fighting for its life. The German captain made his first serious mistake at 0559. Instead of shutting down his engines and assessing the situation calmly, he increased power and tried to force his way through the mesh. The additional thrust drove his submarine deeper into the net. Steel cables wrapped around the hull, the conning tower, the propeller shaft. Every movement made the situation worse. The net designer Bentley had copied from fishing trawlers was working perfectly. The more the submarine struggled, the more entangled it became. Physics and engineering combined to create an inescapable trap. At 6:02, the submarine's periscope broke the surface. Bentley could see it clearly through his binoculars, a thin steel tube extending 6 feet above the waves. The German captain was trying to assess his situation visually, trying to understand what had caught his boat. The periscope traversed left and right, scanning for threats. The captain would see HMS Starling approaching from the south. He would see the two trawlers positioned on either side of his submarine, but he wouldn't understand the steel net wrapped around his hull until it was far too late. Bentley keyed his radio and broadcast on the international emergency frequency in clear English and German. German submarine, you are trapped in anti-submarine nets. Surface immediately and surrender your vessel. You cannot escape. Do not attempt to dive or you will flood your boat. The periscope disappeared. For 3 minutes nothing happened. No engine noise, no bubble streams, no movement. The German captain was probably conferring with his officers, trying to decide whether surrender or continued resistance offered better odds of survival. At 6:08, compressed air roared from the submarine's ballast tanks. The captain had made his decision. He was surfacing. Bentley watched the dark shape emerge from black water like a steel whale breaching. First the conning tower, then the forward hull, finally the entire 200-foot length of a German Type 7 U-boat. Steel cables were wrapped around the submarine, like Christmas ribbon around a package. The net had fouled the propeller, jammed the diving planes, and tangled in every external fitting. The submarine was completely immobilized, hanging in Bentley's trap, like a fish in a trawler's net. The conning tower hatch opened. A German officer emerged, looked around at the 3 British warships surrounding his submarine, then raised both hands above his head. Other crew members followed, climbing onto the deck with their hands raised in surrender. Bentley counted 47 German sailors on the submarine's deck, the entire crew of U-573, according to intelligence files. One of Germany's most experienced submarine crews, commanded by Kapitänleutnant Klaus Friedrich, a veteran of 23 combat patrols. HMS Starling closed to 100 yards. Bentley used a megaphone to address the German captain directly. "Captain Friedrich, I am Commander Bentley, Royal Navy. You and your crew are prisoners of war. Prepare to be boarded." Friedrich responded in excellent English. "Commander, how did you catch us? We detected no mines, no depth charges, no sonar contacts. What weapon did you use?" Bentley couldn't resist answering. "Fishing nets, Capitan. Simple fishing nets." The German officer stared at him for several seconds, then began laughing. Not bitter laughter or nervous laughter, but genuine amusement. Friedrich called something in German to his crew. Several of them began laughing too. Later, during interrogation, Friedrich explained his reaction. "Commander Bentley, we German submariners have always feared your destroyers, your depth charges, your advanced sonar systems, but fishing nets? No one in the Kriegsmarine considered fishing nets a threat. It is so simple, so obvious, so completely unexpected. You have made fools of us all." The boarding party from HMS Starling secured U-573 without incident. The submarine's crew offered no resistance. They seemed almost relieved that their war was over. Many had been at sea for 6 months straight, living in a steel tube 200 feet long and 20 feet wide. The intelligence value was extraordinary. U-573 carried complete navigation charts for the North Atlantic, code books for submarine communications, technical manuals for torpedo systems, and detailed reports on German submarine tactics. More importantly, the crew included specialists who knew everything about German submarine technology, but the real victory was psychological. For the first time in the Battle of the Atlantic, the Royal Navy had captured a German submarine completely intact, not damaged by depth charges, not crippled by ramming, not scuttled by its crew, simply trapped like a fish in a net. News of the capture reached Admiral Noble within 6 hours. His response was immediate and decisive. Every available fishing trawler in the British fleet would be converted to net deployment vessels. Production orders for steel cable were placed immediately. Training programs for net operations were established at Portsmouth and Plymouth. The mockery stopped overnight. Officers who had called Bentley's idea ridiculous were now requesting transfers to net deployment commands. The primitive fishing net concept had become the Royal Navy's most effective anti-submarine weapon. But Bentley wasn't finished innovating. The success at Hebrides Gap had proved his basic concept worked. Now he wanted to refine the technique, improve the technology, and deploy nets on a scale that would terrorize the entire German submarine fleet. His next target was the Bay of Biscay, where German submarines had to pass when leaving their bases in occupied France. If nets could work in the narrow Hebrides Gap, they could work anywhere German submarines travelled. The war beneath the waves was about to change completely. Completely. The Bay of Biscay operation required everything Bentley had learned from Hebrides Gap, multiplied by 10. The bay stretched 400 miles along the French coast. German submarine bases at Lorient, Saint-Nazaire, La Pallice, and Bordeaux dispatched U-boats into the Atlantic daily. Intelligence estimated that 60% of all German submarine traffic passed through specific choke points in the bay. Bentley's plan was audacious even by Royal Navy standards. Deploy 200 steel nets across the most heavily used submarine routes. create a maze of invisible traps that would force German captains to choose between capture and diving so deep they couldn't reach their hunting grounds. The logistics were staggering. Each net required 12 tons of steel cable, 2 trawlers, and a crew trained in deployment procedures that most naval officers still considered experimental. Now, the entire operation would need 400 vessels, 8,000 sailors, and enough steel cable to stretch from London to Edinburgh. Admiral Noble approved the plan in April 1942, but with reservations that kept Bentley awake at night. The Royal Navy was already stretched thin across the Atlantic, Mediterranean, and Pacific theatres. Committing 400 vessels to net operations meant fewer escorts for convoys, fewer patrols for hunting submarines, fewer resources for offensive operations. If the Bay of Biscay nets failed, the Royal Navy would lose ships, crews, and credibility. If they succeeded, German submarine operations could be crippled for months. The stakes couldn't be higher. Bentley established his headquarters at Plymouth in May 1942. His staff consisted of 12 officers, most of whom had never seen a fishing net before joining his command. They had to learn everything from scratch: cable specifications, deployment techniques, maintenance procedures, tactical coordination. The learning curve was brutal. Early training exercises resulted in tangled cables, damaged trawlers, and crews who questioned whether their commander had lost his mind. One exercise in Plymouth Sound ended with 2 trawlers connected by 400 feet of twisted steel cable that took 6 hours to untangle. But Bentley persisted. He brought in fishing fleet veterans to train naval crews. He simplified deployment procedures until they could be executed in rough seas and poor visibility. He developed communication protocols that allowed multiple net deployments to work together without interfering with each other. By June, his crews could deploy a net in 12 minutes. By July, they could do it in 8. By August, experienced teams were completing deployments in 6 minutes, even in moderate seas. The fishing fleet veterans watched these improvements with professional admiration. Naval crews were learning fast. The first Bay of Biscay deployment took place on September 3, 1942. 20 nets across the approaches to Lorient submarine base. The operation began at midnight in conditions that would have been perfect for German submarine transit. Calm seas, no moon, scattered clouds blocking starlight. Bentley coordinated the deployment from HMS Starling, positioned at the centre of the net field. Around him, 40 trawlers moved into position with precision that would have impressed peacetime fishing fleets. Each crew knew their exact coordinates, their deployment sequence, their escape routes if things went wrong. The nets were invisible to sonar, undetectable to magnetic sensors, and completely silent. German submarines approaching Lorient would encounter what appeared to be empty ocean. Only when steel cables wrapped around their hulls would they realize they had swum into a trap. Intelligence predicted that 6 to 8 German submarines would attempt to reach Lorient between 0200 and 0600 hours. U-boats returning from Atlantic patrols always timed their approach to arrive at their bases before dawn, minimizing exposure to Royal Air Force patrols. The first contact came at 0347. Sonar detected a submarine 4,000 yards northeast of the net field, running submerged at 8 knots. The acoustic signature matched a Type 7 U-boat, probably returning from patrol with empty torpedo tubes and low fuel. Bentley tracked the submarine's approach on his plotting board. The German captain was following a route that would take him directly into the centre of the net field. Course 240 degrees, depth 45 feet, speed steady at 8 knots. Textbook submarine navigation for these waters. At 0352, the submarine's engine noise changed. Increased power, erratic propeller sounds, compressed air releasing from ballast tanks. The U-boat had encountered the first net line and was struggling to break free, but 20 nets covered this approach route. Breaking free from one meant swimming into another. The hydrophone operators reported sounds they had never heard before. Multiple submarines thrashing in nets simultaneously, steel cables snapping under tension. electric motors running at emergency power. The entire net field was alive with trapped submarines. By 0415, 4 German U-boats were caught in Bentley's steel web. Their captains made the same mistakes that Captain Friedrich had made at Hebrides Gap. Instead of stopping engines and assessing the situation calmly, they increased power and tried to fight their way through the nets. Each struggle made their situation worse. The nets were designed to tighten under pressure, like knots that grew stronger when pulled. German submarines were accomplishing exactly what Bentley had hoped they would do, trapping themselves so thoroughly that escape became impossible. The first submarines surfaced at 0423. U-594, commanded by Captain Lieutenant Dietrich Hoffmann, emerged from black water wrapped in steel cables like a gift package. The conning tower hatch opened immediately. Hoffmann appeared with his hands raised, followed by his entire crew. HMS Starling approached to accept the surrender. As Bentley's boarding party secured the submarine, he could see 3 more U-boats struggling in nearby nets. The operation was exceeding every prediction. Instead of capturing one submarine, his nets had trapped an entire wolf pack. The second submarine, U-607, surfaced at 0431 after its captain realized that continued diving would flood the boat. The third, U-751, broke the surface at 0438, with its propeller shaft completely fouled by steel cables. The fourth submarine, U-132, attempted to surface, but became so entangled that only its conning tower cleared the water. By sunrise, Bentley had captured 4 German submarines, 188 prisoners, and intelligence materials that would keep Royal Navy cryptographers busy for months. More importantly, he had proved that fishing nets could be deployed on an industrial scale to dominate entire ocean areas. The German reaction was swift and revealing. Within 48 hours, Kriegsmarine headquarters issued new orders to all submarine commanders. Avoid the Bay of Biscay approaches to French bases. Use alternative routes that added 200 miles and 3 days to each patrol. Accept the additional fuel consumption and reduce time on station. German submarine productivity dropped immediately. U-boats that previously spent 21 days hunting Allied shipping were now spending 18 days on patrol and 3 days navigating around net fields. The mathematics of submarine warfare had shifted in Britain's favour, but the Germans were learning too. Captured submarine charts showed that Kriegsmarine intelligence had begun mapping Royal Navy net deployments. They were developing tactics to detect nets before swimming into them. They were designing new equipment to cut through steel cables. Bentley realised that his fishing net revolution had begun an underwater arms race. The Germans would adapt to nets, just as they had adapted to depth charges and sonar. His advantage was temporary unless he could stay ahead of German countermeasures. His solution was characteristically simple and completely unexpected. If Germans were learning to avoid nets, he would make the nets come to them. Mobile nets, nets that moved, nets that hunted submarines instead of waiting passively for submarines to find them. The concept violated everything naval strategists understood about static defences, but Bentley had stopped caring about conventional wisdom. His fishing nets had already accomplished what the Royal Navy's most advanced weapons couldn't do. Now he wanted to push the concept beyond anything anyone had imagined. Mobile net deployment required faster vessels, stronger cables, and crews trained in tactics that resembled hunting more than fishing. Instead of setting traps and waiting, net vessels would pursue German submarines actively, surround them with steel cables, and capture them like cowboys roping cattle. The engineering challenges were immense. Mobile nets had to be deployed while moving at 12 knots. They had to maintain structural integrity during high-speed maneuvers. They had to be recoverable quickly when German aircraft appeared or when submarines fought back with deck guns. Bentley's team spent October 1942 developing mobile net prototypes. They tested different cable weights, various deployment mechanisms, and multiple recovery systems. Early tests were disasters. Cables snapped under dynamic loads. deployment mechanisms jammed during high-speed operations. Recovery systems failed when nets became fouled with debris. But by November, they had working prototypes that could deploy 300-foot mobile nets in under 4 minutes. The nets were lighter than static versions, but strong enough to stop submarines. They could be towed at speeds up to 15 knots and recovered in less than 2 minutes when necessary. The first mobile net operation took place on December 7th, 1942, exactly 1 year after Pearl Harbor. Intelligence had located a German submarine refueling from a supply vessel 120 miles west of Brest. 2 U-boats were taking on fuel, food and torpedoes from a converted merchant ship. Bentley approached with 6 vessels, arranged in a hunting formation he had copied from fishing fleet tactics. HMS Starling led the group, followed by 4 net deployment vessels and 1 recovery ship. They would surround the German submarines, deploy nets in a closing circle, and capture all 3 vessels. The approach took 2 hours through moderate seas and scattered rain showers. German lookouts spotted the British formation at 8,000 yards, but by then it was too late to dive. The submarines were connected to the supply ship by fuel hoses and could not submerge quickly. At 1,200 yards, Bentley ordered net deployment. His 4 vessels moved into position like experienced fishermen surrounding a school of tuna. The nets descended into grey water in a perfect circle 800 yards in diameter. The German submarines were trapped inside with nowhere to run. The supply ship captain attempted to ram HMS Starling, but Bentley had anticipated this tactic. He manoeuvred away from the ramming attempt while his net vessels tightened the circle. The steel cables rose from 60 feet deep to 30 feet, then to 20 feet, finally to 10 feet below the surface. Both U-boats tried to dive, but the net circle was already too tight. Their hulls struck steel cables at 40-foot depth. The more they struggled, the more entangled they became. Within minutes, both submarines were completely immobilized, hanging in nets like fish in a trawler's catch. The supply ship surrendered without further resistance. Its captain, a veteran merchant marine officer, impressed into Kriegsmarine service, told Bentley that he had never seen naval tactics like this. "You fight like fishermen," he said, "not like Navy officers." Bentley took that comment as the highest compliment he had ever received. The mobile net success at Brest convinced Admiral Noble that Bentley's unconventional approach deserved unlimited support. In January 1943, the Royal Navy authorised production of 500 mobile net systems. Every major naval base in Britain began training crews in mobile deployment techniques. By February, Royal Navy net forces had grown to 1,200 vessels and 15,000 sailors. They operated from bases in Scotland, Northern Ireland, southern England, and Gibraltar. German submarines could no longer find safe passage anywhere in British-controlled waters. The psychological impact on German submarine crews was devastating. Veterans who had terrorised Allied shipping for 3 years were now afraid to surface in areas where British net forces operated. Morale reports intercepted by Royal Navy intelligence showed that German submarine crews called British net vessels sea spiders and considered assignment to the Atlantic a death sentence. But Bentley wasn't satisfied with defensive success. His nets had proved they could capture German submarines efficiently and safely. Now he wanted to take the concept one step further: offensive net operations deep in German-controlled waters. His target was the Baltic Sea, where Germany trained new submarine crews and tested advanced submarine designs. If Royal Navy nets could penetrate the Baltic and capture submarines in German home waters, the psychological victory would be as important as the tactical success. The Baltic operation would be Bentley's most dangerous gamble yet. German naval bases, coastal artillery, and air patrols made the Baltic virtually impregnable to conventional Royal Navy forces. But fishing nets might succeed where battleships would fail, precisely because they were so unexpected, so primitive, so completely unlike anything German defenders were prepared to encounter. The planning began immediately. The Baltic operation required everything Bentley had learned about submarine warfare, multiplied by the audacity of attacking Germany in its own backyard. The Baltic Sea was Hitler's private lake, surrounded by German naval bases, coastal fortifications, and airfields packed with Luftwaffe fighters. No Royal Navy vessel had operated in the Baltic since 1940, but Bentley saw opportunity where others saw suicide. German submarine training operations in the Baltic followed predictable patterns. New U-boat crews practiced the same maneuvers in the same areas month after month. Advanced submarine prototypes underwent sea trials along established routes. If nets could penetrate German defences, they would find targets that couldn't run, couldn't hide, and couldn't call for help without admitting they'd been caught by fishing equipment. The logistics were nightmarish. Baltic deployment meant sailing 800 miles through German-controlled waters, past Norwegian coastal batteries, through the Skagerrak Strait, past Danish islands bristling with radar stations, into waters patrolled by German destroyers and monitored by shore-based observers who reported every unusual contact. Admiral Noble listened to Bentley's Baltic proposal for 45 minutes without interrupting. When Bentley finished, Noble stared at the charts spread across his desk, calculated the risks, weighed the potential intelligence value, and made a decision that surprised everyone in the room. "Commander Bentley, you have authorization for Baltic penetration, but this time you're taking submarines, not fishing trawlers." The plan Noble approved was audacious even by Bentley's standards. 3 Royal Navy submarines would carry disassembled net sections into the Baltic. They would surface at night, deploy the nets using inflatable boats, and wait for German training submarines to swim into the traps. If successful, they would capture German crews and escape before coastal defences could respond. Bentley selected his submarine commanders carefully. Lieutenant Commander David Walsh commanded HMS Seawolf, a veteran of Mediterranean operations, with 23 successful patrols. Lieutenant Commander James Morrison led HMS Sturgeon, fresh from Atlantic convoy duty, with a crew that specialised in silent running. Lieutenant Commander Peter Hayes captained HMS Swordfish, the newest submarine in the Royal Navy fleet, with experimental equipment designed for special operations. Each submarine carried modified net sections weighing 800 pounds per boat. The nets were smaller than Bentley's standard designs, but strong enough to stop training submarines operating at shallow depths. Deployment required surfacing completely, a procedure that violated every submarine warfare doctrine written since 1914. The 3 submarines departed Scapa Flow on February 15, 1943, sailing independently to avoid detection. They would rendezvous in the Baltic on February 22nd, deploy nets on February 23rd, and execute captures on February 24th. The entire operation had to be completed in 72 hours before German patrol patterns made discovery inevitable. HMS Seawolf reached the rendezvous point first, arriving at 0200 on February 22nd in complete darkness. Walsh positioned his submarine 12 miles southeast of Bornholm Island, in international waters, but close enough to German training areas to intercept U-boats practicing night surface operations. HMS Sturgeon arrived at 0330, followed by HMS Swordfish at 0415. The 3 submarines maintained radio silence, communicating only through predetermined light signals that mimicked merchant ship navigation lights. To German observers, they would appear to be neutral Swedish vessels conducting legitimate Baltic shipping operations. Intelligence had identified the target area through months of signal intercepts and aerial reconnaissance. German submarine training school at Kiel dispatched new U-boats to practice areas southeast of Bornholm every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. The submarines conducted surface navigation exercises, diving drills, and torpedo firing practice using the same routes their instructors had learned in 1939. February 24th was a Wednesday. German training submarines would begin exercises at 0600, following established patterns that British intelligence had mapped precisely. 3 U-boats would participate, 1 experienced boat with instructor crew, 2 training vessels, with student crews learning basic submarine operations. Bentley's plan required his 3 submarines to surface simultaneously at 0530, deploy nets across the German exercise route, and submerge before sunrise at 0645. The German training submarines would encounter the nets during their first exercise period, become entangled, and surface in confusion just as British submarines rose to accept their surrender. Everything depended on timing, weather, and German predictability. If the training schedule changed, if storms prevented net deployment, if German patrols discovered the operation early, 3 Royal Navy submarines would be trapped in German waters with no escape route. At 0525, on February 24, 1943, 3 British submarines surfaced in the Baltic Sea 15 miles from the German coast. Their crews worked with desperate efficiency, knowing that every minute on the surface increased their chances of detection. Inflatable boats deployed from each submarine, carrying net sections and crews trained in techniques that no submarine school had ever taught. The deployment took 18 minutes instead of the planned 12. Baltic waters were rougher than anticipated, and submarine crews struggled with equipment designed for fishing trawlers, not warships. But by 0548, 3 steel nets hung invisible beneath grey Baltic waters, waiting for German submarines that were already departing Kiel harbour. HMS Seawolf submerged at 0551, followed by HMS Sturgeon at 0553 and HMS Swordfish at 0555. The 3 submarines positioned themselves 500 yards from their respective nets, close enough to respond quickly, but far enough away to avoid detection by German sonar operators who were still learning to distinguish between submarine signatures and Baltic shipping traffic. The first German submarine appeared at 0622. U-2518, a Type 21 boat conducting instructor-led training with a crew of 18 experienced submariners and 12 students. The submarine was running on the surface, using diesel engines to charge batteries while navigating toward the exercise area. Lieutenant Commander Walsh watched through HMS Seawolf's periscope as the German submarine approached his net at 8 knots. The U-boat's lookouts scanned the horizon methodically, but they were searching for surface vessels, not submerged threats. The steel net was completely invisible from their position. At 0627, U-2518 struck the first net cables with its bow. The impact wasn't violent enough to alert the crew immediately, but within seconds, steel mesh began wrapping around the submarine's hull, diving planes, and propeller shaft. The German captain ordered emergency reverse, but the backward motion only entangled his boat more thoroughly. The second German submarine, U-3008, encountered Morrison's net 3 minutes later. This crew was less experienced, and their panic was immediate and obvious. The captain ordered emergency dive, then emergency surface, then emergency dive again. Each manoeuvre drove the submarine deeper into the steel mesh until forward motion became impossible. HMS Swordfish's net caught the third German submarine, U-2540, at 0634. This crew reacted professionally, shutting down engines and attempting to assess their situation calmly. But professional competence couldn't overcome physics. The submarine was trapped in 400 feet of steel cable with no possibility of escape. By 0640, 3 German training submarines hung motionless in British nets, while their crews tried to understand what had happened. Radio chatter between the submarines indicated confusion, frustration, and growing fear as the captains realized they were completely helpless. Bentley had anticipated this moment for months. German submarine crews trapped in nets would face the same psychological pressure that had broken their colleagues in the Atlantic. But Baltic operations carried additional risks. These submarines were operating in home waters, with coastal support available within hours. The window for capture was much smaller than previous operations. At 0642, HMS Seawolf surfaced 200 yards from U-2518. Walsh used his deck gun to signal the German submarine while broadcasting surrender demands in German on the international emergency frequency. The response was immediate. The U-boat's conning tower hatch opened and white flags appeared.
Yo!
HMS Sturgeon and HMS Swordfish surfaced simultaneously, accepting surrenders from U-3008 and U-2540 without resistance. The German crews seemed almost relieved that their ordeal was ending. Many were seasick from their submarines thrashing in the nets, and all were exhausted from 20 minutes of emergency procedures that had accomplished nothing except making their situation worse. The boarding operations proceeded with mechanical efficiency. British submarine crews had practiced these procedures dozens of times, using captured German submarines as training aids. Within minutes, all 3 U-boats were under British control, with their crews secured as prisoners of war. But Bentley faced a problem he hadn't encountered in Atlantic operations. 3 captured German submarines couldn't be towed to British bases from the Baltic. The distance was too great, the route too heavily defended, the risk of discovery too high. He needed a different solution. The answer came from Hayes aboard HMS Swordfish. German submarine crews carried detailed charts of Baltic minefields, navigation routes, and defensive installations. More importantly, they possessed current code books for German naval communications and technical manuals for the newest submarine designs. The intelligence value was extraordinary, but it could be extracted without capturing the submarines themselves. Hayes proposed scuttling the German submarines after removing all intelligence materials and transferring the crews to British boats. The operation would take 45 minutes per submarine, but it would eliminate the problem of towing captured vessels through hostile waters. Bentley approved the plan immediately. At 07:05, British boarding parties began systematic intelligence gathering operations aboard all 3 captured submarines. They photographed everything, collected every document, removed every piece of equipment that might reveal German technical capabilities. The intelligence haul exceeded all expectations. U-2518 carried experimental sonar equipment that Royal Navy scientists had never seen. U-3008 contained detailed plans for German submarine bases in Norway and Denmark. U-2540 had complete technical specifications for the new Type 21 submarine design that German engineers claimed would revolutionize underwater warfare. But the most valuable discovery was personal. The German crews included 12 instructor officers who knew everything about current submarine tactics, training procedures, and operational planning. These men had taught hundreds of U-boat crews the skills they used to attack Allied shipping. Their knowledge would save thousands of Allied lives. By 0730, intelligence collection was complete. The German submarines were prepared for scuttling with explosive charges placed in their pressure hulls. The German crews were secured aboard British submarines as prisoners of war. The operation had succeeded beyond every prediction. At 0735, 3 explosions shattered the morning calm of the Baltic Sea. U-2518, U-3008, and U-2540 disappeared beneath grey waves, taking with them any evidence that Royal Navy forces had penetrated German home waters. To German coastal observers, 3 training submarines had simply suffered mechanical failures and sunk in deep water. The 3 British submarines began their escape immediately, following predetermined routes that would take them through different exits from the Baltic. HMS Seawolf would transit the Great Belt, HMS Sturgeon would use the Orison Strait, and HMS Swordfish would navigate the Kiel Canal, using forged German papers and captured uniforms. The escape took 18 hours of silent running through waters crowded with German patrol vessels searching for the missing training submarines. But by 0200, on February 25th, all 3 British submarines had cleared German territorial waters carrying 54 German prisoners and intelligence materials that would occupy Royal Navy analysts for months. The Baltic operation's success convinced German submarine command that their training areas were compromised by unknown security breaches. They relocated submarine schools to Norwegian fjords, changed exercise schedules, and implemented new security procedures that reduced training efficiency by 30%. More importantly, captured German submarine officers revealed that Kriegsmarine morale was collapsing. Veteran crews were refusing Atlantic assignments, knowing that British nets made survival unlikely. New crews were graduating from shortened training programs because experienced instructors were afraid to operate in waters where fishing nets might be waiting. Admiral Noble's assessment was blunt and decisive. Bentley's fishing net concept had evolved from experimental curiosity to strategic weapon capable of crippling German submarine operations. The Royal Navy would expand net deployment to every ocean where German submarines operated. But success brought new challenges that Bentley hadn't anticipated. German engineers were developing countermeasures specifically designed to defeat British nets. Cable-cutting devices, net detection sonar, explosive charges that could sever steel mesh. The underwater arms race was accelerating, and Bentley needed innovations that would stay ahead of German adaptations. His solution was characteristically simple and completely revolutionary. Instead of building better nets, he would make the submarines cut themselves free, then capture them anyway. The concept violated everything he had learned about net design, but Bentley had stopped caring about conventional approaches. His fishing nets had already accomplished the impossible. Now he wanted to accomplish something even more ambitious. Make German submarines destroy their own escape routes while swimming directly into British traps. Self-destructing nets with secondary capture systems. The engineering challenges were staggering, but the psychological impact would be devastating. German submarine crews would learn that cutting through British nets only led to worse entanglement in backup systems they couldn't see. The underwater war was about to become even more bizarre. The development of self-destructing nets began in March 1943 at a secret facility in the Orkney Islands. Bentley assembled a team of 12 engineers, most of whom thought their commanding officer had finally lost his sanity completely. The concept seemed impossible even by the standards of experimental weapons development. How do you design a net that deliberately allows submarines to escape, then captures them more effectively than the original trap? The answer lay in studying how German crews actually cut through steel cables. Intelligence reports from captured submarine officers revealed that German engineers had developed specialized cutting tools. Explosive bolt cutters that could sever 1-inch steel cable in under 30 seconds. Thermal lances that melted through mesh using concentrated flames. Mechanical saws powered by the submarine's electrical system. Every German submarine now carried these tools as standard equipment. Crews practiced net cutting procedures until they could free their boats in under 2 minutes. The tools were effective, reliable, and gave German captains confidence that British nets were no longer insurmountable obstacles. Bentley realized that German confidence was his greatest weapon. If submarine crews believed they could escape from nets easily, they would approach British deployments less cautiously. They would take risks that trapped submarines couldn't afford to take. Most importantly, they would position their submarines exactly where Bentley wanted them when his secondary systems activated. The self-destructing net design incorporated 3 layers of deception. The primary layer consisted of standard steel cables that German cutting tools could sever quickly. This layer was designed to fail, giving submarine crews the illusion of successful escape. The secondary layer used lighter cables positioned deeper in the water column. These cables were invisible to submarines focused on cutting through the primary mesh. When the primary net failed, submarines would swim directly into the secondary trap. The third layer was psychological. Hidden acoustic devices attached to the primary net would broadcast sounds that mimicked British vessels retreating when the net was cut. German submarine crews would believe they had driven off their attackers and won a tactical victory. In reality, they would be swimming deeper into a trap that closed automatically when the primary system failed. Testing began in April using captured German submarines as experimental subjects. The first trials were disasters. Secondary nets deployed too early, alerting submarine crews to the deception. Acoustic devices malfunctioned, broadcasting obviously artificial sounds that aroused suspicion rather than confidence. Timing mechanisms failed under the stress of actual submarine encounters. But by May, Bentley's team had working prototypes that fooled experienced submarine crews consistently. The key was authenticity. Everything had to sound, look and feel exactly like genuine British retreat procedures. Secondary nets had to deploy silently. Acoustic devices had to broadcast actual recordings of British vessels withdrawing from previous encounters. The first operational test took place on June 8, 1943, in the approaches to Gibraltar. German submarines used this route regularly when transiting between Atlantic hunting grounds and Mediterranean operations. Intelligence predicted that U-boat traffic would peak during the second week of June as submarines repositioned for summer campaigns. HMS Starling deployed the experimental system at 0300 hours in perfect conditions. Calm seas, no wind, clear visibility. The primary net hung at standard depth, with secondary systems positioned 40 feet deeper. Acoustic devices were calibrated to broadcast retreat sounds when submarine crews began cutting operations. The target appeared at 0547, U455, commanded by Captain Lieutenant Hans Martin Scheibe, a veteran of 31 combat patrols who had encountered British nets twice before. His crew carried the latest German cutting equipment and had practiced escape procedures extensively. They approached the deployment area with confidence that bordered on arrogance. U455 struck the primary net at 0551. Scheibe's reaction was immediate and professional. Emergency stop, assess the situation, deploy cutting equipment. His crew worked within mechanical efficiency, severing steel cables in predetermined sequence while maintaining perfect depth control. The cutting operation took 90 seconds. As the last cable parted, acoustic devices began broadcasting sounds of British vessels withdrawing hastily. Engine noise fading to the northeast, radio chatter indicating equipment failures, sonar contacts losing definition. Everything suggested that HMS Starling and her support vessels were retreating in confusion. Scheibe ordered his submarine forward cautiously, testing the water ahead for additional obstacles. His sonar detected nothing. His lookout saw empty ocean. The British net deployment appeared to have failed completely, just as German submarine command had predicted would happen once crews received proper cutting equipment. At 0554, U455 swam directly into the secondary net system, positioned 40 feet below the surface. This mesh was lighter but more extensive, covering an area twice the size of the primary deployment. The submarine's forward motion carried it 200 feet into the trap before Scheibe realized what had happened. The secondary net design incorporated lessons learned from 18 months of submarine capture operations. Instead of single cables that could be cut individually, the mesh consisted of interconnected sections that tightened when damaged. Cutting one cable increased tension on adjacent cables, making them harder to sever. The more aggressively a submarine crew worked to escape, the more thoroughly trapped their boat became. Scheibe tried the same cutting techniques that had worked on the primary net. His thermal lances melted through individual cables successfully, but each severed connection caused the surrounding mesh to contract around his submarine's hull. After 20 minutes of intensive cutting, U455 was more thoroughly entangled than when the operation began. The psychological impact was devastating. Scheibe's crew had celebrated their victory over the primary net, only to discover they had been deceived into a worse trap. Morale collapsed immediately. Several crew members refused orders, claiming the British had supernatural powers that made resistance futile. HMS Starling surfaced at 0618 to accept U455's surrender. Schreiber emerged from his conning tower with obvious reluctance, looking around for the British vessels he had heard retreating 30 minutes earlier. When he realized the retreat sounds had been artificial, his professional composure finally broke. "Commander Bentley," Schreiber said during his interrogation, "your fishing nets have become something more than fishing nets. They are weapons that attack our minds as much as our submarines. My crew believes you can make steel cables appear from empty water. How do we fight an enemy who controls our perceptions?" Bentley's answer was carefully recorded by intelligence officers. "Capitan Schreiber, we learned from fishermen who have been deceiving fish for thousands of years. The principles are the same whether your target has gills or propellers. Make them believe they are safe when they are in the greatest danger. Make them believe they have escaped when they have actually been captured." The success at Gibraltar convinced Admiral Noble that self-destructing nets deserved immediate mass production. By July 1943, British shipyards were manufacturing secondary net systems faster than primary deployments could be completed. Every major submarine route received multi-layer coverage designed to exploit German confidence in their cutting equipment. The psychological warfare aspect proved as effective as the physical traps. German submarine crews began reporting encounters with phantom nets that appeared and disappeared without explanation. Acoustic deception devices were deployed independently of actual nets, creating false retreats that lured submarines into areas where real traps waited. The boundary between reality and deception became so blurred that German crews questioned their own sensory perceptions. Kriegsmarine Submarine Command struggled to develop countermeasures for weapons that attacked psychology as much as machinery. Traditional anti-submarine warfare focused on detecting and avoiding physical threats. But British net systems incorporated elements that German tactical doctrine had never considered: deception, misdirection, and deliberate exploitation of enemy expectations. By August 1943, German submarine productivity had declined by 60% compared to peak 1942 levels. U-boats spent increasing amounts of patrol time avoiding suspected net areas rather than hunting Allied shipping. Many submarines returned to base without engaging targets, their crews too demoralized to press attacks against convoys they assumed were protected by invisible steel webs. But Bentley wasn't satisfied with defensive success and psychological warfare. His nets had proved they could capture German submarines efficiently in any ocean. Now he wanted to demonstrate that fishing net principles could revolutionize naval warfare beyond submarine operations. His target was the German surface fleet itself. The concept seemed absurd even by Bentley's standards. German destroyers, cruisers, and battleships were massive steel vessels armed with guns that could destroy net-laying trawlers before deployment operations began. Surface warships had radar, sonar, and lookouts specifically trained to detect unusual threats. They operated in formation, with overlapping defensive coverage that made surprise attacks virtually impossible. But Bentley had identified a weakness in German surface operations that conventional Royal Navy tactics couldn't exploit. German warships relied on speed and firepower for protection. They assumed that any threat would approach openly, announce itself through radar contacts or visual sighting, and engage in traditional gun duels where superior German engineering would provide decisive advantages. What if British forces approached invisibly, deployed nets around German formations while they maneuvered at high speed, and disabled entire squadrons without firing a single shot? The concept violated every principle of surface warfare. But Bentley had stopped caring about traditional principles months ago. His fishing nets had captured submarines that everyone said were uncatchable. Now he wanted to capture battleships. The engineering challenges were exponentially greater than anything Bentley had attempted. Surface warships displaced 10 times more than submarines, and operated at speeds that would snap conventional steel cables instantly. The nets had to be stronger, larger, and deployed by vessels fast enough to keep pace with German formations. More importantly, surface net operations required coordination between dozens of vessels operating at maximum speed while maintaining perfect formation discipline. One mistake would alert German forces to the trap. One deployment failure would expose British net vessels to devastating gunfire from ships designed to sink destroyers with single salvos. Bentley's solution incorporated lessons learned from 2 years of submarine capture operations, combined with tactics borrowed from destroyer flotilla actions and techniques developed by fishing fleets pursuing fast-moving schools of tuna. The result was unlike anything in naval history. High-speed net deployment using modified destroyers operating in coordinated formations. The vessels selected for surface net operations were Royal Navy destroyers stripped of their torpedo tubes and secondary armament to make room for specialized deployment equipment. Each destroyer carried 800 feet of reinforced steel cable designed to stop vessels displacing up to 8,000 tons. 6 destroyers working together could deploy nets capable of disabling an entire German cruiser squadron. Training began in September 1943 using obsolete British cruisers as practice targets. The learning curve was brutal. High-speed net deployment required split-second timing and perfect coordination between vessels operating at 25 knots in close formation. Early exercises resulted in collisions, tangled cables, and nets that deployed in the wrong positions completely. But destroyer crews learned quickly when they understood the tactical possibilities. Successful net deployment could disable German surface raiders without exposing British ships to return fire. The psychological impact would be devastating. German naval crews would learn that their most powerful warships could be stopped by fishing equipment deployed from vessels they had always considered inferior. The first surface net operation was scheduled for October 1943, targeting German destroyers conducting training exercises in the North Sea. Intelligence had identified a German formation conducting high-speed maneuvers 80 miles northeast of the Dogger Bank. 5 destroyers practicing coordinated attacks against simulated convoy targets. The operation required everything Bentley had learned about net deployment, multiplied by the complexity of engaging surface targets, moving at 30 knots through waters patrolled by German aircraft and monitored by coastal radar stations. 6 British destroyers would approach the German formation from different directions, surround them during their training exercise, and deploy nets simultaneously from multiple vectors. If successful, the operation would capture 5 German destroyers and their crews intact. If it failed, 6 British destroyers would be sunk by superior German firepower in waters where rescue was impossible and survival unlikely. HMS Starling led the British formation, accompanied by 5 destroyers selected for their experienced crews and proven reliability under extreme conditions. Each vessel carried modified net deployment equipment and crews trained in techniques that no naval academy had ever taught. The approach began at 0200 on October 15, 1943, in conditions perfect for surprise operations. Overcast skies blocked starlight, moderate seas masked engine noise, and scattered rain showers confused radar operators trying to distinguish between weather contacts and enemy vessels. The German destroyers were detected at 0347, conducting formation exercises exactly as intelligence had predicted. 5 vessels in line abreast, practicing coordinated turns at high speed while maintaining perfect spacing. Professional seamanship, but predictable patterns that made them vulnerable to unconventional attacks. Bentley positioned his 6 destroyers in a hexagonal formation around the German exercise area. Each British vessel approached from a different bearing, maintaining radio silence while closing to deployment range. The coordination required was extraordinary. 6 independent commands converging on moving targets while remaining invisible to German lookouts and radar operators. At 0352, HMS Starling reached optimal deployment position. The German formation was 1,200 yards away, maintaining course and speed through their training exercise. Bentley keyed his radio once, the pre-arranged signal for simultaneous net deployment by all 6 British destroyers. What happened next had never been attempted in naval warfare. 6 steel nets, each 800 feet long, deployed simultaneously around a formation of German destroyers operating at 28 knots. The nets formed an invisible cage 2,400 yards in diameter, with walls extending 100 feet below the surface. The German formation commander noticed unusual radar contacts at 0354, but by then the trap was already closing. His destroyers were surrounded by British vessels, deploying equipment he couldn't identify. Before he could order evasive action, his lead destroyer struck the first net cables. The impact at 28 knots was violent beyond anything submarine operations had produced. Steel cables designed to stop 8,000-ton cruisers caught a 3,500-ton destroyer, travelling at maximum speed. The forward motion carried the German vessel 300 feet into the net before physics overcame momentum. The destroyer's propellers fouled immediately, wrapped in steel mesh that tightened under the tremendous rotational forces. The ship's engines, still producing maximum power, drove the propeller shafts against immovable cables until something had to break. The shafts snapped with sounds like artillery fire. 4 more German destroyers struck nets within 30 seconds. Each impact was catastrophic. Propellers sheared off, rudders jammed against steel cables, hulls scraped along mesh that held them like insects in a web. 5 German destroyers, moments earlier, the masters of their element, became helpless prisoners, floating dead in the water. Harold Bentley's ridiculous fishing nets had accomplished the impossible. From a laughingstock concept rejected by naval command to the weapon that captured entire German destroyer squadrons. His simple idea saved thousands of Allied lives and turned the tide of submarine warfare. Sometimes the most primitive solutions defeat the most advanced enemies. Innovation doesn't come from following rules. It comes from fishermen who refuse to accept that fish can't be caught.